Hi, everyone. It's Tony and Rob here. And today we are talking about how to modernize web forms with trellispark and why this even is a thing and what's happening in the industry today and what Microsoft is doing and how we can help in that regard. So I guess, Tony, the first thing that we want to ask is just what is the reason for the change? What's actually happening? What's Microsoft doing?
So Microsoft is essentially trying to consolidate all of the different flavors and types of the .NET framework and .NET Standard and .NET Core and everything else that started .NET Core in the ecostructure for the last 20 odd years. So what they've done is they've standardized around a new set of technologies that they're just simply calling .NET. So .NET 5 was released 2 years ago. .NET 6 was released last November, .NET 7 will be released this November, and so on. So every year there's going to be a new .NET, and all of the even-numbered .NETs will have long-term support over a couple of years. All of the odd-numbered .NET will just be development versions that you're supposed to renew every sort of like 3 months or so. So essentially, Microsoft are consolidating all of these frameworks. They're trying to make them more efficient. They're trying to make them cross-platform. And as a result of this consolidation activity, they're also saying, well, you know what, we've got all of these old frameworks. So in particularly the .NET 4 .x framework. And they're saying, well, you know what, we don't really want to waste any more time or effort developing new technologies or capabilities on this old structure. What we're going to do instead is we're just going to deprecate it. So we'll still do monthly fixes, patches, security updates, and so on. And it's going to be part of the underlying Windows operating system for years to come. But essentially, this is now deprecated. And so, since 2019, we're not really seeing any advances in the existing .NET 4 frameworks. And, that's now getting to a point where we're starting to see a gap in innovation, right? These things are starting to look old and dated. And it's about time that, most enterprises should be considering, how are we going to modernize? How are we going to adopt these new technologies that Microsoft are making the core of their development activity for the next couple of decades?
Got it. So .NET 4, .x, and web forms is something that ultimately is going to sunset, and we're going to see Blazor and .NET 6 the way of the future, and that's where Microsoft is making their investments. What does this mean from an innovation perspective for an organization? So how is this going to impact the organization, any organization for that matter? If you're already building stuff, you've already have lots of applications that are in .NET 4.
Yeah, so I mean, the bottom line from Microsoft is that, your existing .NET 4 framework applications, should be considered almost like a legacy, right? I mean, you can maintain them. They will be maintainable for the foreseeable future. But anything new, so if you're starting a new greenfield project, if you're going to do some major enhancements, what they're saying is that you should be doing those new projects using the latest .NET solution, and essentially that you should be doing it initially in the long-term support. So right now, that means that any new projects that you initiate should be .NET 6. You can use .NET 7, as the previews come out and into next year as part of a preview type thing, and then you should be switching to .NET 8 for long-term support in a couple of years' time. So, essentially, don't spend time and effort working on .NET applications. If you're going to do, a major change, if you're going to do a major enhancement, if you're going to start a net new project, then, instead of doing something with .NET 4 framework, that's legacy, that's deprecated. It'll be supported for a few years, but really all of the new stuff, all of the exciting stuff, all of the new technologies, the innovation is really going to be happening in the new .NET. And there are some amazing stories that we'll cover in this video. around, the sorts of capabilities and technologies being deployed here. So this isn't like a bad news story. This is a huge good news opportunity story. Microsoft are making our lives as developers significantly easier, and they're also meaning that and this also means that we can provide, better solutions, better applications, better user experiences, to the people who will be using our applications.
Yeah. And so then from that perspective, what does it mean to a company as far as how they're going to move forward with this? Where do they focus? Like, how do they approach this?
Okay, so one of the first biggest things to focus on is your existing .NET framework web forms applications. Because if you look at what a lot of the documentation and the videos and stuff that Microsoft are putting out around the new .NET, how are you going to upgrade, a .NET Core 3.1 application? How are you going to move an MVC application? So there are projects and wizards that you can run over those particular framework types, and essentially the new version of .NET really is like an enhanced .NET Core. So you can upgrade those older MVC and Razor Page applications to the new .NET. But where it's really more of a problem is around the web forms applications. So the web form application in .NET 4 framework is a completely different architecture. So essentially what we're going to be looking at there is redeveloping those .NET 4 framework web form applications from scratch. So as an enterprise, one of the things that you should be looking at this point is, what do I already have in terms of applications that use web forms? And then how do I want to modernize those applications over the coming years? I mean, it's not something you have to do immediately. It's not something that's got to be done by the end of this year. But if you've got a lot of these things, and if they're big applications, then it's something you should be starting to think about. Pilot some ideas, level up your dev team, get ready for this modernization process. And initially, that modernization function, you're going to be looking at the web form applications first, and then maybe some of your older desktop applications.
Okay, so web forms in particular, apps that have been built using .NET web forms, that's the first focus. What's the best approach to modernize these web forms?
Okay, so as an enterprise, if you've already been building a lot of web form applications on the Microsoft stack, then you've probably got some in-house development team and experience in building on the Microsoft stack. Now, although the new .NET is a very different architecture to what you have in web forms, it will be very familiar to most of your Microsoft developers. So it would only make sense for you as an enterprise to say, well, okay, I need to modernize these Microsoft .NET 4 web form applications. What do I modernize towards? And the answer to that, when you look at all of the available technology and documentation that's been put out by Microsoft, is to rewrite these old legacy web form applications using the Blazor technology. Okay, so Microsoft have been working on Blazor for the last 4+ years. It's based around C#. It's a bit of a combination of being able to embed code inside HTML, CSS. So it's using all of the things that your developers will already be familiar with. So as a learning curve, moving them from web forms to Blazor applications is probably the easiest option to level up your dev team to take advantage of this new technology. Now, the other thing that you should be doing when you're looking at modernizing these web forms is learning all of the lessons of the last couple of decades as it relates to enterprise architecture and sustainability, right? Because if we're going to go and modernize all of these frameworks and all of these applications, then the other thing we should be looking at is, how do we adopt modern DevOps practices in our workflow? How do we adopt, microservices type approaches to actually build better as we actually migrate this. And then the other thing that's really amazing about these new Blazor applications is it gives us a much more reactive and faster user experience from the perspective of the person who has to actually use these applications. So I mean, as developer tools, it gives us a really tremendous jump in terms of the capabilities that we can bring to our applications. So focus around Blazor technologies and then just level up that, make sure your dev team can understand and can embrace these new technologies, that they've got access to proper training and resources, so that they can adopt the best practices for using Blazor, as you actually work through a process of reviewing and piloting and then ultimately modernizing these web form applications.
Okay, so definitely being able to build your applications in a more sustainable manner where it's more future-proof and you're able to actually make lots of changes as your company evolves, that's really important. And then having a much more reactive, modern user experience using Blazor. What else can you describe around how you can actually improve the user experience? We've heard a lot of things about Blazor from Microsoft. What's your thoughts around this? Where do you think we can really make a real impact in the user experience?
Well, Blazor is, an open source project that Microsoft have been running for years. I mean, if you look at the advancements in the Blazor technology over the last 4 years, it's advancing very rapidly. It's doing it in an open source environment. There is a very large and active community, pushing Blazor. A lot of organizations basically are picking it up and running with it. And effectively, Blazor has become almost the core user experience technology for Microsoft. And although, Microsoft provide Blazor in 2 formats, the WebAssembly or the server mode, I personally am a huge advocate of using Blazor in WebAssembly. I think it enables us to build much faster applications. They're much more scalable because a lot of the work is happening on the client's browser instead of on a server. They're more robust because I don't have to maintain a connected session all of the time. So Blazor as a technology in and of itself is fantastic. Okay. But that's just the start of Microsoft's user experience discussion now, because one of the other things that Microsoft are really trying to do with the new .NET is make it completely cross-platform. And one of the other major initiatives that Microsoft are currently working through their first release of at the time we're talking here in March in 2022 is that they're building a new technology called MAUI, which will enable us to take the very same Blazor components that we're building for our websites and then embed those components without having to recompile, without having to do anything else. We're going to take those Blazor web components and we're going to put them in MAUI native applications that we can then run on desktops. So on Linux, on Windows, that we can run on mobile platforms like iOS and Android, whether it's a phone or a tablet. So all of the user experience that we're going to be developing for our websites using Blazor can then be immediately repurposed so that we can use that same technology across all different platforms.
Yeah, very cool. And the stuff that's coming out from Microsoft around what we're going to be able to do with MAUI is really awesome. I mean, the ability to be able to do the cross-platform from Blazor into MAUI is going to be really interesting. What are the key steps then? So if we're going to take a web forms application and move it into Blazor, what would be the process to modernize that application?
Okay, so this is the bad news part of the video. Okay. There can't be like everything's rosy and golden, right? I mean, that would be beautiful if that was the case, right?
Right.
But unfortunately, there is some bad news. And essentially, our web forms applications were written using the 4.x framework, and it's an architecture that was developed, decades ago. And it has basically a bunch of limitations. As Microsoft are moving to .NET, they've said, well, you know what, we really need to take advantage of new technologies, new approaches. And as an organization, we're really sorry, but the .NET 4 framework is deprecated. So what that means in practice to us is that for all of these web forms user experiences, all of our ASPX pages and code behind, all of that underlying architecture and technology is now deprecated / obsolete. So, the really bad news is that all of those ASPX pages and their form behind code is going to have to be rewritten. Okay, so if we've got web applications with hundreds of web forms and millions of lines of user experience code, the bad news is that's all going away, right? If we're going to move to Blazor or any of the new .NET technologies, we are saying goodbye to that old code. So when we sort of like think about, well, okay, what are the steps to modernize our web formats to Blazor? We could go, form by form, field by field, and just simply replace it with a Blazor equivalent. I mean, we could do that, right? And, going through that process, we're saying, well, every single one of these new forms is going to have a rewrite, right? We're going to have essentially the same user experience, but we're going to have to completely redo, the code behind that. And when you sort of like consider how a lot of web applications have worked over time, is these web forms have had a mixture of the actual user experience. So what can you see? What can you do? And that, to a certain extent, in many applications, has bled into the business logic. So, a well-disciplined team would have encapsulated all of that in a set of business classes. Less well-organized teams may have incorporated some of that logic in the actual web form itself. And then some people will have even built, dynamic T-SQL that's executing in the context of the web form that then updates the database directly. So the knock-on impact of losing the web form and its code behind it, having to rewrite that, is that we're also going to have to reconsider, refactoring some of our business logic. Okay, so, we're going to have to be looking at replacing the user experience, refactoring the business logic. And then again, another thing that I've seen quite frequently with a lot of the projects and the people we've worked with is that they've tended to build up a big backlog over time of extra fields they want to add into their data models, redundant fields that should have been removed, new concepts or new relationships between concepts that they want to put into the database as well. And these things have been stacking up for months, right? Because it's hard to change these legacy applications, where you've got to ripple the data model change through the business logic, through the user experience. And you're going to go through, a simple approach where we're saying, well, I'm going to take an existing web application and form by form, I'm going to go through a replacement to Blazor. You could be looking at something that's going to be very consuming, very expensive, and ultimately is a business risk. So that's the bad news, right? We will, when we're looking at Modernize, really have to understand how do we add business value as we modernize, and what's the better way of doing it.
Okay, so we definitely have, from a developer's experience and knowledge, it's the right approach to take advantage of Blazor, but we have to also recognize that that means a complete rewrite of all of these web forms, especially in the front end and the user experience. So there is certainly a lot of work associated with that. What is the alternative approach to attacking this? How do we help? Like, what is it that that an organization can do to take this approach in a different way?
Okay, so modernizing our web forms to Blazor is a great opportunity, right? We can, as we go through this modernization process, work through, tidy up all of the backlogs, right? We can look at how do we modernize both the user experience of the application and its underlying architecture, take advantage of new technologies, and to a certain extent clean up all of the issues and things that we've had stacking up from the past. Now, we want to be careful how we do that, right? I mean, we don't want to try and bite off too much. We want to go through a process of attacking this in a simple staged way, right, where we start off with maybe a pilot and then we're starting to build out from there. Okay, so we're going to want to look at ways of rebuilding that user experience, maybe of building back better in terms of the database and the data model. And there are some really good advantages in terms of, modern architectures and technologies that we can take into account as we actually go through this process. Now, obviously, GreatIdeaz has been going through this process for the last couple of years, and we have been building out our own approach, which we're basically providing as a framework called trellispark, that really does simplify this process and takes out a lot of the cost and the risk of actually going through this process. So essentially what we're doing with trellispark is we're going to offer you a different approach. We're going to offer you a way of leveling up your own IT team so that they are able to take on the challenge of modernizing the web form applications into Blazor, to take advantage of the latest technologies in terms of enterprise architecture and DevOps, and to do that in a way that makes the transition from one to the other quick, simple, and easy. And we want to get away from this idea of modernizing a web form application form by form, field by field is the way to go, right? We want you to sort of like think about there's a way of actually replacing this legacy application in a way that enables you to deliver that business value and to deliver it significantly faster than just a simple translation on a form level.
Okay. So yeah, definitely from as far as our organization and GreatIdeaz, we bring a lot of knowledge. We've gone through this process for our own core product, and we have the capability with the trellispark framework to provide a user experience in .NET 6 using the WASM Blazor technology. How does it work then? So if an organization were to take trellispark and use it to actually modernize one of their web forms, how would that work? What is it that trellispark ultimately would help as far as the process would go?
Okay, great. So what we looked at with trellispark was all of the really cool technology and ideas that were being released with Blazor. And we also looked at, how people are building applications, and we look beyond the simple examples that come with Blazor, right? So when you take Blazor out of the box, there's a form, it's got a counter, and it's got a list of whether, and it's a really simple, primitive example, okay? So one of the things that we were looking to do as we migrated our existing solution into trellispark, into Blazor, was saying, well, okay, how can we really do, a lot of work with the architecture as a whole and with the technology as a whole. So one of the approaches that we developed was around this idea of data agnostic service architecture. So the idea that essentially what a page is displaying is a record. It doesn't matter whether that record is a record of a vehicle, of a person, of an insurance policy, of a patient in a hospital. It doesn't matter what the record is, right? It is a sequence of fields that are displayed on a form, and that data needs to be persisted into a database. And so what we've worked with is this idea of producing a data agnostic solution. Now, what this data agnostic approach means is that we can actually eliminate all of the basic user experience, create, read, update, delete functionality from our code. So instead of basically having to recreate every single form, every single field, all of the information about the access rights, the roles, the states, and all of that user experience code that would normally exist on a web form code behind, what we've done is we found a way of representing all of that in data, so that essentially what you can do is that you can build a database model of the user experience that says, well, this form is going to display a vehicle. These are the fields, and Rob has this role and Tony has this role. So Rob can do these things and Tony can do these things. And instead of that being, millions of lines of CRUD code, we've basically abstracted that into data. So what that means is that you've now eliminated a significant percentage of all of the software that would have existed in your web forms application. And when you look at most web forms application, that can easily account for 90 to 95% plus of all of that code that used to exist in your code behind. So when you're looking at how do I modernize, either I can deform my form and try and recreate all of that code in my new Blazor form, or we can go to a data agnostic approach where we completely replace the way we're doing the user experience. Now, that then has a really great knock-on effect into the refactoring work that we would have to do in the business logic. So again, one of the really cool things about data agnostic services is it gives us a framework for building workflow. So instead of the workflow being incorporated into the web form and in some way being dependent on the user experience, what we're looking at with data agnostic services in trellispark is a way of actually factoring that business logic so that each individual workflow action can be deployed as its own separate unit. So it's going to go to the data agnostic record storage. It's going to pull the information it needs into that particular workflow function. It will transform that data and put it back. So we know we're going to be refactoring business logic anyway, right? This just gives us a way of refactoring that business logic to build a very advanced microservice architecture that then is very robust and scalable. It's easy to actually build, test, and deploy these discrete workflow components and then manage them more effectively to build a more sustainable framework. And then finally, we touched on it a little bit with this idea of the data agnostic record service and the fact that we're displaying a record, whether it's a vehicle, whether it's a person or so on. In the data agnostic record storage, what we're saying is let's store our information instead of in a standard table set of relational fields and tables. Let's actually store this in a generic format. Let's use XML or JSON and store essentially a document, that describes the actual contents of the record. And then when I want to display the vehicle, I can pull the vehicle record document out of it with a data form definition and then render the user experience to the user dynamically as a set of Blazor components. And then again, we touched on this idea around the user experience around Blazor and the fact that you can then take those exact same Blazor components that we're using to render that user experience on a website and then redeploy these into MAUI applications. So we can take that same user experience and then redeploy that to native desktop applications, tablet applications, phone applications, and so on. So, what we're doing with trellispark is we're taking the opportunity to modernize this traditional web form application approach where there's a field, there's code behind, there's lots of CRUD code that says, here's what I'm going to display, here's what Rob can see, here's what Tony can see, here's what the state of the... All of that has gone away, right? We've eliminated that. We've refactored the underlying workflow and business logic, and now we're able to display that across a website, across a mobile device, whatever, right? So it's trying to make sure that this modernization isn't just a changing technology, right? I mean, there's no point executing a multi-million-dollar project if all you're going to do is take the old app and turn it into the new app, but it's essentially got the same flaws, right? I mean, we want to do something where, we're transforming not just what the app is doing, but how our application can support our business in the future. So with data agnostic services, we end up with a much more sustainable application. So again, one of the things that we spoke about earlier is that, even adding and removing fields, we can be waiting months for that as a business. But if we're using data agnostic services and those fields are defined as part of a data model that I can just add a new field in minutes, why would I have to wait months for that to be deployed? I can make that change quickly and efficiently using data agnostic approaches. And the trellispark basically is built around all of that technology. So essentially what trellispark is going to do for you is it's going to significantly reduce the amount of code that you write. The code that we're going to need to refactor, it's giving you a brilliant framework for refactoring that code. And it's also addressing some of the DevOps challenges that we have with our legacy applications where, people are afraid to make changes because if I add a new field here, I don't know which existing business logic or forms I'm going to break somewhere else in the app. So when we're talking about modernization, we shouldn't just be looking at modernization of .NET 4 framework into Blazor. We should be looking at modernization of everything that sits around that. We can deliver some real business value.
Okay, so this all sounds nice. I mean, obviously, trellispark, we know it deeply from a product perspective for GreatIdeaz. Tony, you're a senior developer that has a critical thinking mind. I'm sure we've got a lot of developers out there that are watching this video and going, okay, well, it sounds great, but I'd have to actually see for my own eyes and actually use this and see how it works. How can someone actually try this out? What kind of resources do we make available? What's available for them to actually just prove everything that you've been saying?
Yeah, and that's exactly what a lot of people are going to think, right? I mean, anytime you see a vendor giving you a good news speech, you're thinking, is this true, right? Is this smoke and mirrors? Okay, and no, this isn't smoke and mirrors. This is concrete technology that I personally have been working on for decades, and my team at GreatIdeaz have been working on and refining this particular iteration of trellispark now for years, and we've produced a ton of free. Right, so free, i.e. no cost, content and resources for you to actually go and have a look, right? Because, we're developers, right? We hear the speech all the time from other developers. And when you sort of look past the video and the presentation, it's all ideas, right? It's not proven, right? There's nothing there that you can actually, look at, download and work with. So we are providing free a ton of content and resources for you to actually take the meat of this discussion and see how it actually works in reality. So part of our GreatIdeaz.com website, we have a section on there called the TrellisSpark Academy. So as my development team have been building things, we've been documenting what we've been doing, and we've been providing those documents as part of the TrellisSpark Academy. And anybody can actually go to the TrellisSpark Academy. It's completely free. There's no paywall. You can go in and you can have a look at how we're using Blazor, how we're using WebAssembly, how we're using the new .NET technologies, how it integrates with things like Power BI, and pretty much everything that we're doing in TrellisSpark essentially is being exposed there. So you can actually see, what we've currently done, what we're working on, what we're working towards, and get a good sense of, what is TrellisSpark as a tool set. And,
Tony, you highlighted something. So sorry to cut you off there, but you highlighted something that I think is really important for people to know and recognize, especially if there are developers listening to this. A lot of the content that we put out there in TrellisSpark Academy, it's actually written by the developers. So this isn't content that is, gone through this, a process where somebody else is writing that documentation. The content itself is coming from the source. So you're getting some pretty accurate detail for any of the technical reference documentation we have in there.
Exactly. And essentially what's being documented is all of the lessons that our development team have learned as we've gone through this process of modernizing a web forms app to take advantage of the latest .NET technologies, of the latest enterprise architecture, data agnostic services, and so on. Okay, so what's being documented there from a developer perspective is everything a developer would need to go through this process themselves without making the mistakes that we inevitably had to make and go through for the last 2 years. Now, beyond the written material, okay, so it's one thing to have a document that says, here's how you integrate this with this, right? What we've also done is on the GreatIdeaz portal, you can sign up to the GreatIdeaz portal. It's not going to cost you anything, and then you get access to more resources. Okay, so some of the things are available on the GreatIdeaz portal. We can go in and you can go in as a developer, as part of a team, and you can create a demonstration workspace. So all of the information, that's being held in our data agnostic record storage is held in a workspace. Each workspace defines its own security context. So essentially you can create a demonstration workspace to see a whole bunch of example functionality that my team has built out to demonstrate different capabilities and technologies of the trellispark framework. So, like a lot of organizations, we focused around things like customers, client management, orders, invoicing, pricing, suppliers, that sort of thing, right? So you can see, how that sort of functionality would work in a trellispark environment. But bear in mind, it's a data agnostic framework. So it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with customers and orders as it relates to, say, healthcare, home care provision, or whether or not you're using it to build, an insurance provider backend for brokers, or whether or not you're going to use this thing to build the next version of Uber. Okay. I mean, essentially, although the workspace gives you an example of the sorts of things that you could easily build with trellispark, it's not the limit or the extent of trellispark. It's enable you to give you a sense of, well, if you want to do this scheduler, what a scheduler would look like. If you want to integrate this with Power BI, here's how you're going to get Power BI out, and here's what that's going to look like. You're going to create an order, it looks like this. If you're going to introduce workflow, it's going to look like this. If you want to build, your own action types and order types, here's how you would do that to try out the form builder type functionality that we've got. So essentially, the demo workspaces are giving you a sense of what you can do with trellispark, and the default look and feel that comes with trellispark if you just pick it up out of the box and say, there it is, right? There's trellispark. Here are the components that trellispark is being deployed with out of the box from GreatIdeaz. We use a lot of Telerik controls in the background, so here's how we're wrapping those controls. Here's how all that looks. And essentially that demo workspace just gives you a sense of what's possible, how quickly it works, and how quickly you can build and extend, and the sorts of different user interfaces that you can create. So the demo workspaces give you an example of what you get from GreatIdeaz out of the box as it relates to trellispark, right? They give you a sample, an idea of what you can actually achieve. But we wanted to go deeper than that. I mean, this is a new technology. This is maybe something that's unfamiliar to you. And the whole thing around Blazor is, part of, what the training activity should be about. So the other thing that we're exposing through our GreatIdeaz portal website is all of the source code for that user experience that you've just looked at. So you can download that source code onto your own servers, onto your own workstations, and look in detail at every piece of code that's being used to render that user experience, how all of the components work, how they actually interact with the Telerik components, how you can embed JavaScript inside those components if you need to use the JS interrupt functionalities. And all of that source code is available to you so that you can see how all of the demo workspaces work, and how it's built, and how it's constructed, and how easy it's going to be to extend. Now, what we also enable you to do is, because we've given you that source code, it's free, download it, play with it, look at it, use it as a training example for sure. But if you actually want to deploy your own version of the trellispark solution using your own branding, and maybe add some custom controls of your own to the solution, all of the documentation is there to do that. All of the videos are there to help you actually go through that process. And we want you to go through a process where you can actually customize the look and feel of these Blazor components so that you can deploy them as you need in your website. So, we're not giving you a closed box. Here's trellispark, these are the components, that's all you can do. What we're giving you is an open toolbox framework that says, here is a baseline of all of the work that we've done to date with the user experience. And bear in mind, every release, which is typically about 2 or 3 months for us, we're going to be doing more components, more automation, more user experience. So it's going to be an ongoing shifting target as the technology changes, as the really cool technology comes available for us to play with. We're going to be constantly innovating and extending this, but we're giving you the latest source code that we currently work with all of the associated documentation through the TrellisSpark Academy, so you can see what we've done and how we've done it, and how you can take it, run with it, adapt it, and produce something that meets your needs better than we're all already doing. If you're not a developer, you can actually take that same download, and that contains copies of all of the executable projects that are in our current production build. So you can actually just deploy an instance of this solution in your own environment and then actually use that to test and execute. So you've got two choices, right? You can take the box that GreatIdeaz is providing as a set of executables, host that in your own infrastructure, tie up to your own database, and then see how that works. And you can take the source code for that user experience. Here's how we built it. Here's all of the documentation. Customize it, brand it as you will, and then deploy that in your own infrastructure. So both of those are available. All of the material that we've talked about here is free. We want you to have confidence that trellispark is going to be educational. It's going to show you how we went through a year's worth of modernization to actually get from web forms into Blazor. It's going to show you all of the great technologies that we're currently working with, and it's going to show you our relentless innovation path as we go through the next few years, and we're constantly updating as new technologies are available. And it's going to educate you on here's all of the lessons we learned, right? This is probably the best way that you could go through to actually modernize your applications and make sure that you're staying on top of this technology going forward. And it's all free, right? I mean, how much cheaper can you get, right? Free is free, right? There's no cost, right? All of this stuff that we've talked about here in terms of the training, we're going to do webinars, all of the documentation, all of the source code, all of the executables, all of that sample material is there for the asking. And all we ask you in turn is to treat this with an open mind, to actually go in, have a look at this material, download it onto your own environments, evaluate it in any way that you wish. And if you've got questions, if you've got comments and feedback and suggestions for how we can do things better, we welcome that interaction. Okay, so we really want you to give us feedback and say, well, okay, what, this was good, but this could be better, right? I mean, it would be really nice if this form popped up in this way instead of over here. So what we want to do is say, is we're going to give you a bunch of free resources to really teach you how to use and how to modernize these web form applications. And all we ask in return is that you give us some feedback and say, well, we really like this, but we really hated that. Right. And then that way we can improve, what the trellispark framework is, so we can help businesses all over the world basically be more successful in modernizing those web form applications. And ultimately, as we move into the MAUI space, how we would then upgrade the desktop applications as well, and the mobile and the tablet, and basically build a much healthier Blazor ecostructure.
That's awesome, Tony. And absolutely, we've got so much free stuff that we've actually put out there for someone to start their journey and really understand how they could modernize their web forms into Blazor, leveraging a lot of the stuff that we've put out there with trellispark. Of course, we're also a full services company, so we can provide additional services. So even if you needed more than that, we can provide additional services to help you with that. And, just to recap the whole thing, definitely moving towards Blazor. .NET 6 is going to be a huge win for the organization. There's so much that you'll gain by going down that path. Microsoft is investing millions in this technology, and it's become the centerpiece of all of the new stuff that they're going to be rolling out in the coming years. So that's huge. It's a big deal. And you definitely want to start to consider moving towards that path. And if you already have existing web forms that you're looking to modernize, Blazor is an outstanding option to do that. And take a look at our GreatIdeaz website. Take a look at trellispark Academy. We've got all sorts of resources there to help you through that journey, to go through that process. Certainly, we've got some innovative ideas around how you can do that, and we've been through the process. And I hope you guys have an interesting time looking at this information and you enjoy actually going through that stuff. And if there's any feedback that you can provide to us around any of the information or resources that we have, we really welcome that feedback.
To learn more about GreatIdeaz products and solutions, visit greatideaz.com. That's GreatIdeaz with a Z, Thanks.